Morning, everybody. How are you doing today? Today we're not going to discuss the politics side of things at all. I'm doing an episode I wanted to do for a long time, but I've been so busy with other things that I haven't really had the time to focus on it. And I recently just did a show with my band, and I like to take a few days off after a show to kind of clear my palate, as it were. And so I took that opportunity to kind of do this work then. And I made these two sheets, and they show all the labels. There's a timeline up here from 45, 50, 55, 60, 65, 70. And it just shows you kind of the timeline of all the labels and then who ended up buying that label. And I'd like to put this onto a spreadsheet or some kind of Word document. But being the old fuck that I am, this is kind of how I do things on pen and paper. And I think it would be an interesting thing for people to see. But what we are going to talk about today is what this allows me to glean. And it's stuff I kind of knew, but it really gives a more concise overview. And really kind of allows for a nice look at what's happening in jazz, time frame wise, label wise, and to give a real insight into where the innovation was and how different and how quickly that changes every 4 or 5 years. And so today's episode we're going to focus on primarily the late 40s and coming out of the war. For those who aren't history people, from 39 to 45, Second World War. And there was a recording band during that war. There was a shellac drive where a lot of the pre-war LPs, sorry not LPs, 78s made of shellac, were melted down for war purposes. Millions of records were melted down and lost. Millions of records have been sold prior to the war, which is testament to how big the music industry already was in the 30s, even during the Depression. Music was a great alleviator of that dust and grind that is life. And the Goodmans and the Paul Whitemans and the, I mean, it's a pretty impressive how many 78s are still out there today. And I think a good chunk of those are probably post-war 78s. I'm sure there are some 30s and 20s 78s out there in collections and 78 stores, which means not a lot of those. But I think most of the times when you stumble across a box of 78s in someone's attic, it's going to be stuff from the 40s into the early 50s, because they were still doing the 78s into the mid 50s. Most labels were. And of course that transition to 10-inch LP happens 49, 50. Then again another transition 12-inch LP 45, 54, 55. And some of that is going to be important in seeing the dynamics of these labels, and some of them were driven out of business by some of those transitions. Some of them didn't choose to buy all new inventory in stock to make that transition. But when we're talking the post-war 45 to 50, jazz is a very different landscape than the jazz we know of today, or even the jazz that existed before the war. And there's one great kind of harbinger of what's to come, I think at 39, and it's the great Coleman Hawkins recording Body and Soul. And it really was a fantastic, virtuistic impression of that song, kind of removing normal chordal thematic melody from it and just improvising on the chord changes. And it's kind of a precursor to what bebop was to become. And Coleman Hawkins, for all of his swing pedigree, really stays near the cutting edge throughout the ensuing decades. I mean, the places he shows up, from bebop sessions to hard bop to some soul jazz recordings to some of the free jazz stuff with Max Roach and Freedom We Insist, like, he's showing up in a lot of places, Coleman Hawkins. And he's the great innovator of the tenor saxophone. and along with Lester Young and Ben Webster, he's like the three illuminating voices of that instrument, and does for the tenor what Armstrong does for the trumpet. So it's not shocking that Coleman Hawkins stays on the landscape, but it is a little shocking just how cutting edge he remains, how much he stays at the forefront of. And I think the older generation, like the Coleman Hawkins, always retain the respect of the younger guard. Whether you're Duke Ellington, whether you're Coleman Hawkins, whether you're Lester Young, I mean, any of those guys that managed to live into their 50s and 60s, because a lot of them, like Lester, Charlie Parker, died quite young. Lester, I mean, I think was probably in his late 50s, but Parker was in his mid-30s, if I remember. So against the backdrop of the post-war years, the fractured promises of the post-war generation for the black community, the freedom that they fought for and didn't receive when they came home, the new economic landscape, the exiting of the white Americans from the urban East Coast centers, the building of the freeways, the white flight, the suburban manufacturing jobs, all this is emptying out the black neighborhoods and of white people and leaving them very black and impoverished, leaving the black jazz musicians struggling to make a living. The poverty never really subsides in black America, pre-war, post-war depression. It's pretty universal language. All of which meant that maintaining a large swing band was really near impossible. And Ellington tried and kind of managed to do so throughout most of the 40s and 50s and the 60s. and he had a recording contract with Columbia most of those years, which was the pinnacle of the recording industry in terms of your financial return, distribution, how well you'd be promoted across country. Ellington had the luxury of being. Armstrong, of course, was largely with Decca, some at Columbia, those guys had big labels kind of backing and endorsing them. So, on some degree, Ellington and Armstrong are a bit out of this conversation. Even though we do talk about the major labels here in this diagram, they existed well before the war. Also, have felt the consequences of the recording ban. But when it comes to black American jazz music, these labels were always 5-10 years behind what was happening in black music. Just like Vanilla Ice was 8 years behind where hip-hop was. I mean, black jazz music that was being put out on Columbia and Capitol and RCA was always a more comfortable, safe version of that music that wasn't cutting edge. It had established itself, had found a white audience, and the major labels were like, okay, yeah, let's put that out. That new black music, and it was already, well past its sell-by date. Not to say that Armstrong and Ellington and those guys weren't making great stuff. Ella Fitzgerald, she was at Decca. But it didn't represent the cutting edge of black music. And post-war, bebop really starts to take shape. At places like Minton's Playhouse in Harlem, the young black troubadours were kind of getting together post-gig and just blowing and playing. And the innovations of one young bird, Charlie Parker, really starts to illuminate a new direction in the music. And others like Dizzy Gillespie and Howard McGee and Bud Powell, Thelonious Monk, these guys come along and help codify it and help make it a music that was going to be the cutting edge of jazz for the next 5, 6, 7 years. Fats Navarro. However, that cutting edge wasn't danceable, it wasn't pop, it wasn't really even accessible. It had melody in it, and the great players like Parker could always make it melodic and somehow beautiful, but it was an acrobatic roller coaster of a sound, jumping through all kinds of loops and kind of defying musical theory and adding all the different steps of a scale and making solos these long, fluid, languid lines that weren't restricted by the chordal melody of a song. And oftentimes they wouldn't even state the melody of the song that they were playing. They would just improvise on those chord changes. And it was free jazz before free jazz. Accessible, it wasn't. And so in these post-war years, you have a real dearth of this music being recorded. It wasn't going to appeal to the large general audience. The major labels weren't really touching bebop. And so what you end up having is this kind of small selection of mostly East Coast, a few West Coast labels that were dabbling in recordings here and there of bebop. And this would still be on the 78 RPM form. And they would eventually be transcribed into the 10-inch LP in the dawn of the 50s. And then most of the good stuff ends up getting, again, released in 55, 56 on LP. And the bebop movement doesn't last long. By 49, 50, the cool jazz movement comes along with Mulligan, Connaughton, Miles Davis, and Gil Evans. And that kind of spawns this whole new West Coast cool, melancholic sound that had Western European composition laced in with jazz improvisation. The third stream kind of comes out of that even more down that vein. Hard bop comes along in 53, 54, driven by guys like Clifford Brown, Max Roach, driven by the Miles Davis Quintet, driven by Horace Silver and Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers. And so by 53, 54, jazz is kind of taking bebop and simplifying it and reducing it into hard bop. And then, of course, the West Coast white kids were doing cool bop, which was a cooler, more up-tempo version of hard bop. But it wasn't West Coast cool. It was still hard bop. It was blistering tempos, and the formula of those East Coast black musicians was being replicated by those West Coast white musicians. So it was an interesting time in jazz. And in the 40s, post-war, most of the labels that we think of as the great jazz labels don't exist. And a few come along and are birthed in the late 40s. And even Blue Note goes back to 39. But Blue Note in the 39 to 40, really to 53, 54, Blue Note isn't the Blue Note we know. Blue Note is Meade Lux Lewis, Pete Johnson, Albert Ammons, the great boogie-woogie piano players. And Alfred and Frank love those guys. Coming over from Germany, they love that boogie-woogie piano stuff. Blue Note was licensing European recordings and issuing them. From things as different as Dizzy Gillespie in 52, 53 to a ton of Sidney Bechet stuff that was being recorded in Paris. And then Blue Note was licensing it and issuing it in America. And I'll show you some of that stuff here in a little bit. So Blue Note wasn't Blue Note as we know it. They were recording some sessions on their own from my recollection. But a lot of what they were putting out was, like I said, reissuing licensed material from Europe or other places. None of the traditional sounds of bebop are documented by Blue Note. At least very little. And what wasn't until 52, 53, as Blue Note starts to shift towards a more modern take on what's happening in black music. Prestige doesn't come along until 1949. Riverside's not till 53. So the first thing we're going to talk about right now is Savoy. And Savoy is really, along with CLEF and KEYNOTE, the preeminent label for black musicians to record bebop in the late 40s. And I'm going to show you a few 10 inches here, which again is stuff culled from the 78 RPM era, and some of it actually might be recorded in the early 50s as well. But Savoy, under Herman Lubinsky, who was not a good human being by any recollection, still was giving opportunity to young black musicians in Newark, New Jersey, to come from the Tri-State area, and record this new black music. And from Parker to Hawkins to Lester Young to, I mean, it's a really Fats Navarro. There's a really great documentation of black music being recorded at Savoy in the late 40s. And a little bit misconstrued here, some of the stuff at Savoy issues in the 50s from the 40s and early 50s wasn't recorded by Savoy. A lot of that stuff was recorded by other small labels. DG, Dizzy Gillespie's label, Signal, Discovery in the early 50s. And Savoy bought them up when they went out of business and reissued them with different covers, made them look like Savoy recordings. So there's some stuff Savoy doesn't get credit for, even though they helped redistribute it in the 50s. And most of that stuff, as it gets reissued today, like the Art Pepper Surf Ride, that's a Discovery session from 52, 51. So not really a Savoy session, so you shouldn't really give them too much credit for some of that stuff. But that being said, Herman Lubinsky and Teddy Reeg, who Teddy Reeg was this kind of short, fat, diminutive little Jewish fellow from New York, hung out in the Village and downtown, and was a preeminent figure on the streets of New York. He was a hustler, he was a pimp, he was probably somewhat like the Sidney Falco character in Sweet Smell Success. And maybe he wasn't selling news tidbits to columnists, but he was certainly connecting musicians with labels and clubs and drugs and women and other musicians, and he was just a real guy who had his ear to the streets. And he's working for Herman Lubinsky at this point, and their relationship doesn't last long. They're both fiery, stubborn characters. Lubinsky was a big, tall Jewish fella, and Teddy Reeg was a small, kind of fat, stubborn, very different bred horses. You had a mule and a black stallion, and they weren't really very congruent in their ways of seeing things. But Teddy Reeg did have more of the respect of the black musicians and treated them with more dignity than Herman Lubinsky ever did. And as he comes into the studio and brings these black musicians in, they record some pretty important sessions at Savoy. And I'm going to just show you a few things here. And if you look at the early 12,000 series from Savoy, or if you want to even go back further and look at the 10-inch sequences, I mean, I have the entire 12,000 sequence, which is all the reissuing of the early 10 inches and the 78 RPM that was worth reissuing. And they were sprinkling new material in there as well in that 12,000 sequence. But if you look at that chronology on, say, Wikipedia, you'll see how many important names, and very few of those really important names are actually being recorded at that time. Here's a Stan Getz session. Cover's kind of beat up. 9004. Probably early 50s there, to be honest. Lester Young, tenor sax solos. And I'm pretty sure that's from the late 40s. The great Lester Young. 9002. And I have quite a few Savoy 10-inch, but I certainly don't have them all. It's something when money and my situation changes, I'll try to fill in more of those, even though I have, like I said, most of it on LP. Here's the great Fats Navarro, a great trumpet player. Sadly, a guy with a bad addiction, and he wasn't long for this world. A great bebopper, in every sense of the term. The Birth of Bop. And this is a part of a series. I think there's 5 volumes to this. And this was taking 78 RPM era bebops recordings. And the names here are Charlie Parker, Dexter Gordon, J.J. Johnson, Milt Jackson, Leo Parker, Stan Getz. I mean, it's the entire series is filled with really preeminent late 40s recordings. Marion McPartland is a British piano player. I like the cover a lot. I think it's a Burt Goldblatt cover. And Goldblatt was one of the preeminent art directors, graphic designers in jazz at that point. Here's Jay and Kai, J.J. Johnson and Kai Winding. 2 great bone players who play on the edge of bebop. Johnson especially kind of really was the preeminent trombone player in the bebop movement. You have Wallace Cirillo on the piano, Charlie Mingus on the bass, Billy Bauer on guitar, Kenny Clark on the drums. So, I mean, high pedigree players there. Don Bias, Again, a fantastic player who sadly went to Europe for a long time and kind of fell out of the American eye. Kenny Clark, one of the most important drummers in the bebop era, really kind of helps define and change the sound of how drumming was going to happen post-war. I think this session is probably more early 50s with Percy Heath, Gerald Wiggins, the West Coast piano player, Bags, which is Milt Jackson, who was under contract, probably at Prestige at that point, Walter Benton, another West Coast guy, and Frank Morgan, another West Coast guy. So a lot of the West Coast session there. So you can see Savoy is kind of doing some pretty impressive stuff. Another label I want to talk to you next about was ALLADIN. And ALLADIN was out of LA. And it was run by another Jewish guy, if I recall, by the name of, where's his name? Come on. Sorry. Eddie and Leo Mesner. The two brothers. Not the name I thought it was. That was something else. But ALLADIN does some good recordings. ALLADIN has a number of other labels that spring off of them, including Score and Intro, Jazz West, which makes 8 or 9 great recordings in the mid 55 or so. That's all really affiliated with the ALLADIN label. And eventually the label Imperial under Lou Chudd comes along and buys the ALLADIN family. But in the late 40s, they record stuff like Illinois Jack Cat and Lester Young, ALLADIN number 701. And I'm pretty sure this was a 78 session first. It could have been just an early 50s. But ALLADIN does go back to 45. And not all these labels were doing jazz from their inception. And many of them continued after the jazz age and did different things. Like Savoy really stops doing jazz 61, 62 and starts doing gospel and some soul. And just they really deviated away from the jazz of the 50s and really ceased to become a jazz label in most senses. But a great cover showing Jack Cat and Lester Young and wonderful documentation. This is King Cole, which is the great Nat King Cole, as a very young piano player here, with Red Callender on bass and again Lester Young on the tenor. Again on ALLADIN number 705. These are pretty tough penances to come by. And then I have some ALLADIN stuff here on LP that was originally earlier material. This is Lester Young on ALLADIN Volume 1. This is what we've been listening to. Here's some Illinois Jack Cat, number 708. And again, this was initially a 10-inch, but I think it was actually 78s originally. More stuff from Lester Young that's culled together on LP there. So you see ALLADIN has a nice little footprint. And there's some other artists and recordings as well by names that are fairly obscure in today's language. Another label that was very much an important part of this history was the Dial label. And Dial has these kind of benign covers. There's that Dizzy Gillespie cover. That's what the other covers looked like. Howard McGee, Fats Navarro, Miles Davis, Dizzy Gillespie, the Modern Trumpets, Dial 212. And these covers look more like the 78 era sleeves that 78s would have been in. And Dial wasn't exclusively a jazz label. They're doing a lot of classical stuff and a fairly wide range of stuff. But they're responsible for some of the seminal Charlie Parker recordings of 47 and 48. And so again, Blue Note, Prestige, Riverside, none of those labels are really a factor at this point. It's Dial and Savoy and ALLADIN that are kind of at the cutting edge of what jazz is doing. In these sessions, you have Miles Davis, Howard McGee, J.J. Johnson, Lucky Thompson, Ward L. Gray, Errol Garner, Dodo Marmarosa, Duke Jordan, Tommy Potter, and Max Roach. I mean, it's kind of a who's who of those early beboppers. This is a fairly comprehensive box set. The Dial label. I want to find the guy's name. Come on, where is it? There it is. By a guy by the name of Ross Russell, I think it is, Ross Russell. But the Dial stuff from Parker, which does come on a 10-inch. It's got the front kind of famous covers with him with the hat, and fantastic documentation of Parker's innovations and how Parker was kind of leading the pack and shaping and changing the direction of the music of that era. So along with Aladdin on the West Coast and Dial and Savoy, you have Keynote. And Keynote is a comprehensive box set of 1,000 records. I think it's like 15 records or something. And Harry Lin, a young Filipino or Indonesian American, fell in love, I think, through army ties somehow, and ended up being the head engineer producer of Keynote label. And the label kind of predates his time there, but Keynote from about 45 through 48 under Harry Lin. The label itself goes back to 40, but again, there's a recording band in there. He records so many important jazz artists of the bebop era, and there's some post-swing stuff in here, there's some Dixieland stuff in here, probably some boogie woogie if I recall, but the sessions here are just top of the mark for this era. And when people reference back to the 40s era, along with the Dial Parker, some of that Savoy stuff, and a few others I'm going to mention here in a minute, it's these Keynote recordings that are so important. Guys like Willie Smith, who were kind of forgotten, Chubby Jackson, who's kind of forgotten, Milt Hinton, Bud Freeman, Jonah Jones. You have Coleman Hawkins does a lot of stuff. Charlie Shaver does a lot of stuff. The Kansas City Seven, Cozy Cole. It's Lionel Hampton, Lester Young. It's Variant Pete Brown, who's a fantastic alto player and very forgotten. Red Norvo, Billy Taylor shows up, a young man. Jonah Jones, more Hawkins, more Shavers, Cozy, Barney Biggard. It's a pretty impressive. J.C. Hurd, the drummer, has a quintet here. It's an incredible, risky Benny Carter, Juan Tizzle, the fantastic Ellington alumni in his orchestra. I mean, it's really an incredible documentation. Neil Hefti has a recording here, who ends up recording Batman, and that's Neil Hefti. Early on was a jazz arranger and band leader. Dave Lambert of Lambert Henriksen and Ross ends up making a session here with Buddy Stewart and Red Rodney's Beboppers. Bill Harris, the great trombone player. And then Lenny Tristano shows up as one of the last sessions here at Keynote. Keynote made the mistake of trying to press their own records. And they bought and invested a bunch of money on that side of the industry, and it cost them dearly and kind of drove them out of business. But this session was issued by the Japanese probably in the late 80s, and it's a pretty comprehensive booklet, and obviously part of it's in Japanese, but the backside is all in English, documenting each session, the players in each session, Harry Lin's contribution to this enterprise. And again, Keynote is to the 40s what Blue Note is to hard bop in the late 50s. Keynote is a very important label, and because it's not really on the LP era, I think it escapes many people's horizon. But it was eventually bought by Mercury out of Chicago, and Mercury does reissue a lot of the most important Keynote recordings on Mercury Jazz Series. I think it's the 20,000 series. And so you can stumble on those in record stores for next to nothing because they come out in the 60s and 70s. They're not really highly collected by people who don't know. And so you can buy those old Keynote recordings from the guys like Hawkins and Lester and other important players. Buy those Mercury recordings for pretty affordable pricing. But by all means, seek out that box set. It's a really important part of understanding the developments in jazz. And it was a wonderful, forgotten chapter in jazz history. Another label out of New York, ran out of a little bookstore, was called Commodore. And the Commodore bookstore was a place that people gathered. It was a social gathering place. People could protest and talk about communism and capitalism and race and progress and all the issues that we were facing as a civilization. And Commodore is probably most famous for issuing Billie Holiday's Strange Fruit, which Columbia didn't want to touch. They're like, yeah, we love the message, but we're not going near that. And so Billie Holiday has a series of recordings for Commodore, the 20,000 sequence, 20,006 right there. And to be honest, there's a lot of really fantastic stuff recorded here. Edmund Hall and Teddy Wilson, fantastic piano stuff. Again, a lot of this would have been 78s, issued here on 10-inch, and some of it gets reissued on LP as well. The great Eddie Haywood here at the Commodore. What a cool cover that is. That takes me back nostalgic-wise to my young childhood, digging around in my grandfather's basement in Toronto, looking at books of music and books of piano notations, and that kind of cover design would have been fairly familiar to people from the 50s. I mean, it's a fairly common graphic, and jazz was at the cutting edge of a lot of that. The Jump Club, the Riff Room, just I love everything about that cover. And Eddie Hay was a great, fantastic piano player who's kind of forgotten today. Eddie Condon, one of the great swing era players. Jelly Roll Morton, a guy obviously from the New Orleans Dixieland tradition. More New Orleans style, kind of a cool cover though. And some of the stuff you can find for fairly affordable. Kansas City style by Lester Young. So again, you're seeing some of these really important black innovators being documented. Red Norvo, the great vibraphonist, the young red-headed goatee-having Red Norvo. Chu Berry, a fantastic tenor player from the swing era. If I remember, I think he was playing with Hot Lips Page and the early bassy Walter Page groups for a while. Fantastic player, and he had health issues and died really young. One of the great losses in jazz, and his name's kind of slipped under the sheets. We've kind of forgotten Chu Berry, but Commodore here is issuing some fantastic stuff. And then Frank West, this is going to be probably for early 50s, I'm sure. 20031 makes it towards the end of the Commodore 10-inch sequence. So this is certainly early 50s with Oscar Pettiford, O.C. Johnson, Jimmy Jones on the piano, Benny Powell on the trombone, Henry Coker on the trombone, Frank West. And Frank West, of course, is a bassy guy, one of the leaders of the bassy groups. So Coker, Powell, Jones, these guys, a lot of them are bassy alumni. So Commodore is an important label that's putting out a mix of stuff from New Orleans to swing guys and smaller groups to some of the cutting edge bebop sound. Probably not as bebop as what Dial was willing to do or what Savoy was documenting, but all the same, it's a very important label for that era. And again, they issued Strange Fruit, so Commodore does deserve recognition. One more label I'll talk to you, and if I remember, they're from the Midwest, was STNSON. And STNSON's going to lead into my next label I'm going to talk about. But STNSON was a small label, and again, I think this revolved around some of the communist groups that were popping up in the socialist movements and the worker labor movements that were happening in America. A lot of Eastern Europeans were coming into America, but they wanted to bring some of those ideologies of the unions and the strong worker middle class that we should be building in this country. And we know about all the work protests and riots and shootings that happened at factories in the Midwest. And so it was a really fomenting time with those ideologies percolating in a capitalist game of Monopoly where those ideologies didn't really graft in. And so STNSON was doing classical, I think they were doing some Soviet march music and just like weird, and somehow they ended up diving into jazz. And again, jazz is always near the fringes of the political boundaries. So oftentimes people are like, well, you shouldn't talk politics and jazz. Jazz and politics, economics are inextricably linked. And jazz to these social movements was a representation of an oppressed people documenting their freedom through their wonderful talents. So it can't be separated from the fabric. It's like separating skin from flesh from bone. They're all part of the fabric of your being. And so jazz is not something that exists outside of that bubble. Jazz is absolutely deeply linked to all that social movement and progress, and was often seen as part of the voice for those movements. And so STNSON does a series of jazz LPs. I got Herbert Harris and Irving. Oh man, I can't read my own writing sometimes. Irving Hurley or Irving, something like that. I can't read it. Like I said, I want to type that out eventually. But they started recording some jazz stuff in the late 40s. And I think their jazz recordings were mostly from 45, 46, 47. But you have the great Mary Lou Williams, who was a fantastic piano player. And here she's backed by Don Byas, Coleman Hawkins, and Vic Dickinson. I mean, just some great players. Interesting cover. Got the grand piano there. They obviously don't show an African American woman. They show more of an angelic Michelangelo figure there. But wonderful, wonderful, hard to find 10-inch on the STNSON label. Cool little stuff. And again, this would have been 78 RPM stuff initially. These are now some LP reissues of what was initially 10 inches. Coleman Hawkins, again, once we see he's kind of omnipresent in all these different eras and genres of jazz. Hawkins is never too far removed. And it looks like they kind of have some bit of a hawk in there. And he, of course, his nickname was the Hawk. And these reissues that came out, reissued these all on red vinyl, which is kind of neat. And these, you can actually find them for next to nothing. People kind of skip over them, don't recognize that these are great vintage recordings from the 40s. The great James P. Johnson, one of the great Harlem Stride piano players. What a moving cover. That cover kind of sucks you in, doesn't it? It's really pretty fantastic. And so again, STNSON's doing some interesting stuff here. The great Meade Lux Lewis, one of the great Chicago boogie woogie piano players. And Harlem Stride was different from the boogie woogie out of Chicago. But boogie woogie was very popular in the 40s. And again, that's what Blue Note was kind of doing with some of that Harlem Stride stuff. Then you have Art Tatum, one of the greatest piano players of all time, who, his style was Art Tatum. He's kind of devoid of being lumped into any one camp. I'm going to show you a few Blue Note things real quick, just to give you a taste of what Blue Note was doing in late 40s, early 50s. And like, these are going to be 50s 10 inches again, but some of the stuff was initially as 78 RPM. Sidney Bechet, more Bechet. The Hot Jazz at Blue Note, Art Hode's Hot 5, Wild Bill Davison, Art Hode, Sidney Bechet, Pops Foster. Very 50s in its graphic design there. Dixieland Jubilee. So again, what we're not seeing here is the beboppers at all. Jamming in Jazz, High Society, Ballin' at the Jag, 7007. I think it's kind of a compilation if I remember. Sidney Bechet and Bunk Johnson. Bunk's a fantastic player, kind of forgotten today. More Bechet. If I remember, almost all the Sidney Bechet stuff was recorded in France. George Lewis and his New Orleans Stompers, a fantastic clarinetist from that era. More Sidney Bechet. He does a lot of work. And Blue Note really documents his body of work that was recorded mostly in Europe, because he was in Europe for the middle part of his life. Bechet was there. Dixieland Clam Bake, Art Hodes once again. Fun cover. But this is miles away from the Reed Miles Blue Note of the late 50s and early 60s. Graphically, design-wise, musically, racially, it's a very different label still. More Bechet. I mean, there's just a ton of Sidney Bechet here. This is recorded at the Olympia in Paris, 52. Part 2 to that. And then more George Lewis. And those all are from the Blue Note 7000 series, which was the 10-inch sequence that they were issuing most of that New Orleans Dixieland tradition stuff in. And they do start a 5000 sequence. probably 50, 51. And there you see Bud Powell, 5003. And so that is a marking of a gateway where Blue Note starts to change some of their sounds. Fats Navarro. I can't remember if they recorded the Fats Navarro. It might have been actually licensed from Europe again. Dizzy Gillespie, this is definitely licensed from France. And so, so you can see that the changes in jazz are starting to happen quickly. Horace Silver, by this time we're into the 53, 54 range, and the jazz is starting to, Miles Davis shows up here. That'd have been early 50s right there. Kenny Drew, his first session. Howard McGee, who was a bebopper. J.J. Johnson shows up here. Clifford Brown. And then, of course, the Jazz Messengers at Birdland, which really marks the beginning of the modern era at Blue Note. So the last thing I want to talk to you real quick was CLEF Norgran. And, of course, Norgran's really not part of the story yet. Norman Granz was a young impresario on the West Coast. He saw a lot of jazz as an important part of American history. Saw a real vacuum in terms of its production post-war. Didn't really have the acumen to do it, but did it anyway. Starts the jazz at the Philharmonic. And I've shown you that sequence before, but just because I'm doing it, I mean, there's the famous trumpeter Norman Granz, which a lot of the labels had on the inner label for years. That's Lester Young, Jazz Philharmonic Volume 2. Volume 3, I think, has Dizzy Gillespie on the cover. And these are the dawning of the David Stone Martin era, where he's doing these fantastic line drawings. And these would have been all on 78 initially. And they were sometimes put in 78 books, which is like 3 or 4 78s in a book. And then they got the 10-inch releases, and they all got eventually LP releases in 55, 56. And so this, I've done episodes on these before. This is a culmination of so many of the important black jazz musicians of the late 40s and 50s. And also an assemblage of some of the great white talent. I mean, the Bill Harrises and the Flip Phillips. I mean, some of these, there's a mix here. But your rhythm sections obviously were driven by Oscar Peterson in a lot of these recordings. What a great cover that is. It's important stuff in the late 40s. And these shows started off as being not very successful, but they grew into an incredibly successful enterprise. And it ended up him launching the CLEF label, because his earliest recordings he was doing them and licensed them to Mercury. And he ended up getting most of those recordings back and issuing them on CLEF. And then in the early 50s, late 40s, he starts recording as CLEF. And he documents, like Savoy, so many important, great black jazz musicians and innovators. Some of it's bebop, some of it's post-bebop, some of it's modern. But it's all incredibly part of the history of this music. Parker with strings. And this is one of the first gateways into that kind of crossover of the European strings with the great Parker bebop horn. And Parker just floats across those arrangements. The great Bud Powell. Interesting DSM cover right there. Fantastic early bebopper before his breakdowns from abuse and electric shock therapy. More Bud Powell with strings. Of course, there's quite a few Parker recordings. This is Parker with Flippin' Bird, Machito. So this is actually a Machito record. It was a Cuban jazz, Afro jazz player, but Parker shows up in this with Flip Phillips. And there's a lot of Parker at CLEF. And it's all very noteworthy. And then he launches the CLEF 100 sequence. That was 500 sequence. And I think most of that 500 stuff had a Mercury connection. But we start seeing guys like Lester Young. Fantastic DSM cover. Oscar Peterson. More Lester Young. Johnny Hodges, the great alto player from the Ellington groups. The great Illinois Jacquette, one of the real innovators of the Texas tenor sound. The young and fiery Roy Eldridge. The fantastic Billie Holiday. Count Basie records, often with smaller groups here now for Norman Granz. The young Sonny Chris on the West Coast, who was a young bebopper. Lester Young, once again. More Johnny Hodges. Cool cover. His nickname was the Rabbit. More Jaquette. Now, a lot of these are called collates, and it's because they're collating 78 RPM stuff onto these 10-inch LPs. More Lester Young, kind of the inverse color of the other one, with Buddy Rich. These records are so important. There's young Dizzy Gillespie, Stan Getz. By now we're probably in the early 50s. Benny Carter. Great covers, great DSM artwork. So in recap, these late 40s labels, your Stinsons, your Dials, your Savoys, your CLEFs, ALLADIN, they were the labels that were the preeminent force in documenting what was happening in black jazz music at that time. And the major labels, while they were all in full swing and making music, they weren't putting anything out like that. They were putting out very much safer stuff. And I said, right around 49, 50, the Gil Evans, Miles Davis, Jerry Mulligan, Lee Conniff's group records Birth of the Cool, which kind of signals a change in a lot of the music. And so bebop goes one way and the hard bop, and the cool kind of goes this way into the West Coast cool. And Birth of the Cool wasn't really birthed as a cool session. It was just kind of Gil Evans and Mulligan really kind of drafting some new sonics into the music, adding different instruments, tubas and flutes and horns that you wouldn't really associate with jazz necessarily. And it becomes birthed as a cool, and Capitol kind of collects on that by issuing it as Birth of the Cool a good 6-7 years later as an LP. But that wasn't how that section was birthed or designed or came out even initially. Initially it was 78s. So what we have here is a very different landscape from the 50s era jazz of the Verve and the Impulse and the Blue Note, Riverside. I mean, all those great labels from that era, Contemporary Pacific. And the next episode, we're going to dive into the early 50s, which is the 10-inch era, and see what labels show up then. And I'm going to see how the response goes to this, because these episodes are a little bit more work, having to pull a lot of records and stuff, and then I have to refile them all. But it's always fun to kind of go through them and see them all. So I hope you all enjoyed that. I think it's kind of insightful to see it and to recognize how important labels like KEYNOTE and Dial and CLEF were, and how they're kind of the forebearers of what the 50s labels kind of establish, and how the change in formats also was a part of this story. And it really kind of convolutes what came out when, because by 55 all the labels are putting out old material from old formats plus issuing new material, which leads to a glut of things being issued in 55, 56, when only some of it was being recorded in that time frame. So it gets really convoluted as a young collector, knowing when is this recording from. It came out in 55. It doesn't mean it was issued then. It's a bit like the CD era of 89, 90. A lot of that music that was coming out on CD at that point wasn't from 89, 90. Most of it was coming out from the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s. Just being put on that format. So I hope that was informative for people. I hope you enjoyed it. It's a bit of a long episode, but I tried to condense it as best I could and show you as many records as I could. I think it's an interesting chronology to see, and if anybody wants to help me put this chart I made onto a real computer spreadsheet of some kind or Word document, let me know. I certainly appreciate that help. But hope you all enjoyed that. Please support the channel. Go to my Patreon page, YouTube thanks, PayPal. There's a link in the channel. Appreciate you all for watching. Go Kamala Harris. I mean, there's reason for a little optimism there. There's my politics for the day. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. Peace.